worship team for doing a great job on all the songs this morning. It is God's will for our lives that we would maintain enthusiasm for His service until the very end. Until we hear those words, "Well done, good and faithful servant." We've been looking at the life of Joseph the past several weeks to see how to live a faithful life in light of very difficult circumstances, sometimes in light of very positive circumstances, sometimes in light of very unknown circumstances, but to be faithful regardless. And it is the life of Joseph that we conclude today, who sets for us the example, what it means to live a life of faithful service unto the very end. We've looked up to him to about the age of 38 now. We followed him since he was 17. And now today we're going to cover from ages 38 to 110, and we're going to overview those years and look what a faithful life looks like. See, Joseph had a positive attitude, a dynamic faith that followed him wherever he went all the time. The circumstances were not always easy. At times they were more difficult than anything we could imagine. Yet he maintained a faith in God that was unwavering his entire life. And that's the commitment and the example we need to look at and we need to follow today. So there's 4 lessons I want us to follow and learn from on how to have this faithfulness into the very end of our days. And the first one is this: care for your family. We have some responsibilities that need to be maintained in our life. We have some things that need to be taken care of. And if you're in the working age bracket, you need to work. And if you're not, then maybe you have other responsibilities. And oftentimes those responsibilities are caring for family in some fashion or another. I take it from the scriptures that we read on the life of Joseph that Joseph's father was not an easy man to live with and get along with. And in just a few minutes we're going to examine that a little bit more in depth. But we see Joseph maintain faithfulness for his family. See, Joseph had been apart from his family for 20 years after being sold as a slave into Egypt. Finally, they're reunited, and he gets ready to meet his father again. And in Genesis 46:30, here's the verses that we read. "Now I am ready to die, since I have seen your face again, and know that you are still alive." That's the father talking to the son. That's Jacob talking to Joseph. They meet, they hug, they weep. It's such a tender moment. And you would expect at this point in time in the story to read, Joseph's family moved all the way to Egypt, they moved to the land of Goshen, and they all lived happily ever after. Oh, we love those stories. But we need to hit the pause button before we wrap up this story, because there's a couple things we need to know. First of all, Joseph is very different from his family at this point in his life. Joseph has lived in Egypt a long time. We're talking about 20 years. He's been in Egypt longer than he was with his family originally. He looks like an Egyptian. He married an Egyptian woman, has 2 sons who are part Egyptian. He has been immersed in this culture for a long time. And now his family is moving next door. And they are anything but Egyptian. Egyptians were typically clean-shaven. The Hebrews had bushy beards. Egyptians, they looked down on a lot of things that the Hebrews upheld. For example, his family had 2 strikes against him right at the very beginning. Number 1, they're Hebrews, and Egyptians thought all Hebrews were detestable. It's interesting, though, that they don't think that of Joseph. But Joseph has been in Egypt for 20 years. He wears the makeup. His face is shaven. He looks like one of them now. And so he blends in a little bit better. But these other ones aren't going to blend in. And strike 2 is they're shepherds. Shepherds were detestable in the eyes of the Egyptians. And so they're Hebrews and they're shepherds. And on the line of them being Hebrews, think of this. You remember back when the brothers attempted to get food the second time in Egypt. Joseph invited them into his palace so that they could have a meal together. You remember, Joseph had to sit at a separate table than his brothers. The Egyptians ate at one table, the Hebrews ate at another. So you have all these really dynamic backgrounds coming together. I mean, this is almost going to be an Everybody Loves Raymond kind of episode. It's not going to be pleasant necessarily. And so Joseph has a responsibility to meet with his family and take care of the needs. And so that's the difficult background we have coming together in Egypt. But it doesn't stop there. What we also see happen is you have Joseph's father. And he's I think the easiest way to say it, I think he's a whiny old man. I just don't think there's any other words to put it than that. And he's always manipulating people with his age. And you know what? We've seen people like this. Don't you have somebody like this in your family? Every year, about this time or a little bit after, don't you have somebody in your family who says, you know, this might be our last Christmas together. We better make the most of it. I'd sure like to have it at my place because I probably won't be here next year. And don't raise your hand if you got that family member. They might be in this room. But you might be that family member. So, let's just not go down that road. But we all know that person. And we're like, oh, you've been saying this for 20 years. And Joseph's father seems to be that guy. In Genesis chapter 37, the brothers come back with Joseph's robe. It's torn, it's dipped in blood, and he says, a wild animal must have killed my son, and he weeps. And his sons tried to comfort him. He said, no, I will go down to the grave with my son. I'm going to die. And that's a pretty serious time. What he's going through, I can't imagine. But then we fast forward a little bit, and it's not too long later, I think it's in Genesis 43, where the brothers have been to Egypt to get food once. They need to go back a second time. But Joseph told them, you don't come back down there without your younger brother Benjamin. And they tell him, hey, Dad, we got to take him with us if we're going to eat. And he says, no, you can't take Benjamin. If anything even happens to him, I'll die. And then we see it again in Genesis 45 when he finds his son is still alive. He says, I'm going to go see my son, and then I can die. That's right. Do you see a theme here? This is how Jacob has been living his whole life. He's been using his age as a manipulative tool, and everybody buys into it. Now, here's the crazy part. After Jacob actually gets reunited with Joseph, he says, finally I can die, which we just read. It's another 17 years before he dies. Talk about hurry up and wait. That is exactly what happens in this particular story. Jacob is the prime example of this tombstone of the hypochondriac that says, I told you I was sick. Yeah, you've been telling us you were sick for 20 years, At some point you're destined to be right. And that's the life of Jacob. And that's what Joseph has to contend with. Well, let me tell you today, I don't want you to talk yourself into an early grave. Don't be old before your time. Don't go camp out at Cutest Funeral Home. They'll come pick you up when it's time. They have a wonderful delivery service, and they'll take care of it, okay? So just go out and live the life God has given you. It's like a little boy who he was in class, and they had to fill out a card to a family member, and so he wrote one to his uncle. He said, Dear Uncle, I hope you live all your life. I think that's some pretty practical advice. I hope you will live all your life. It is God's desire that we will live out a dynamic faith and have a positive attitude throughout our life. And one of the ways that we need to be faithful is to take time to care for our family. And so Joseph, instead of commanding his position in a dominant way, he goes out and he loves his family. Remember, Joseph is in charge of Egypt, second in command. He can do whatever he wants. He's very busy. He's very important. His family arrives. He could have sent them off to Goshen and met up with them later. But instead, he gets out and he greets his father. He respects his father. He loves his father. And he puts his father first. And they have that wonderful reunion moment. It's a touching scene after 20 years apart. But then Joseph takes some time to coach his brothers, because Joseph's not content with them being in Egypt. He wants to introduce them to his boss. He wants to introduce his family to Pharaoh. But he's also concerned that introducing his brothers to Pharaoh might be like introducing the Clampets to Pharaoh. And so he wants to make sure that this goes as smoothly as possible. And so he gives them some advice. Because you know how some people are. You coach them, you get them ready, but when they're in front of an audience, when they're in front of celebrity, they say and do things they would have never done before. Ann Morrow tells the story that her husband came home from work on a Monday, said, hey, guess what? I invited my boss over from work. He's going to come over Friday night for dinner. His boss was J.P. Morgan, the multi-millionaire. And so, of course, she's on edge right there because he's obviously used to a life of luxury that they don't have. And so she's nervous about the house. But she's even more concerned about their young daughter. Their young daughter was very perceptive and very outspoken. And it just so happened that Anne knew that J.P. Morgan had a huge nose. And I'm talking a nose so big you couldn't see his eyes kind of nose. And she was very concerned that her daughter is going to say something to J.P. Morgan that would be completely insulting. So she spent all week, every night at supper, we don't make fun of other people's anatomy. We don't point out things that it wouldn't be nice. And over they rehearsed this all week long. Well, Friday night comes, and J.P. Morgan comes in, takes off his hat and coat, hands it to Anne. And the little girl walks in, she looks up and freezes. And she sees that giant nose. And you can see the wheels are turning in her mind. And Anne looks at her and looks at JP, and she's crossing her fingers. The little girl says, "How do you do, Mr. Morgan?" Curtsies and leaves the room. Anne says she breathed the biggest sigh of relief she ever had. She goes, "Mr. Morgan, would you like cream or sugar in your nose?" I mean, in your coffee. Oh. Sometimes people get tripped out by celebrity, and it makes them nervous. And so Joseph coaches his brothers. As we've already said, the shepherding job was not really highly esteemed in Egypt. It was despised, simply put. And so Joseph says, don't tell Pharaoh you're shepherds. Tell him you're cattlemen. More generic term, and ask for the land of Goshen, and all will go well. So the brothers get before Pharaoh, and here's what we read in verse 3. And Pharaoh asked the brothers, "What is your occupation?" They replied, "Well, your servants are shepherds, just like our ancestors." They dropped the ball. They completely messed up. I don't think they were doing it intentionally, because remember, Joseph's still the second most powerful man in Egypt. He can kill them if he wants to. And Joseph was trying to make it easy on them, and they just simply dropped the ball. And then he introduces his father in 47 verse 7. Then Joseph brought in his father, Jacob, and presented him to Pharaoh. Now here's what I find real interesting. Joseph coaches the brothers on what to say, but he doesn't coach his father on what to say. He has respect for his father. He doesn't care about the background. He doesn't care that he's bearded and he's weathered and his age wears on him very heavily. He just is excited to introduce his dad to Pharaoh. So let's keep reading. How old are you? Pharaoh asked him. Jacob replied, I've traveled this earth for 130 hard years, but my life has been short compared to the lives of my ancestors. You know, if we could summarize that, Jacob says, my life's been hard and I'm going to die. I think that's basically what he's saying at this point. And then it says he blesses Pharaoh and he leaves his presence. It's a really, really interesting story. And I think there's a great lesson to be learned from this part of the story. And that is, don't be ashamed of your family. Don't be ashamed of your family. Love your family. Care for them. Don't try to hide their characteristics that make them unique or the things that bother you. Just love your family. Marian Anderson tells a story about how she was a famous singer from the 20s all through 1900. She was well known. She was one of the most successful singers during that time. And she was being interviewed, and they asked her, what was the highlight of your career? What was the pinnacle of your singing career and everything that happened? And they were expecting her to say, well, when I sang in front of the Roosevelts of the White House, that was pretty special. Or I sang in front of the Queen of England at the castle. Or she, on one Easter Sunday, she sang in front of the Washington Monument in front of 75,000 people. And they expected one of those moments to be what she mentioned. And she said, the greatest point in my career was when I got to go home to Alabama and tell my mama she doesn't have to take in the laundry anymore. She wasn't afraid to talk about her difficult childhood, how they had to do whatever job they could just to put food on the table. She wasn't ashamed of her family or their background. She was excited she could lift them up out of poverty and have a joyous life. And that was the highlight of her life. And if you could ask Joseph, what was the highlight of his life being second in command of all of Egypt? I don't think it would be building the barns and collecting all the grain and distributing it. I think he would say, it was the day I got to introduce Dad to Pharaoh. What a special moment that was for me. So don't put your family down. Don't be discouraged because of them. Love them and all their uniqueness. One of my favorite titles of a book is Everybody's Normal Until You Get to Know Them. And that's true. We're all weird, let's face it. Just some of us can admit it more freely than others. But love them. And let's cast the net just a little bit wider for a moment before we move on. Love your friends, your close friends. Take care of them. Talk great about them. Be good to them. And don't be ashamed of them. When I was in college, we invited a group, some of my close friends, my roommate and others, to lead the service at Boston Chapel Christian Church. A little country church, but we were going to have someone lead the singing and someone, play the guitar. Someone was going to give the communion meditation. Someone was going to preach. We had all the positions lined up with about 4 students. We were very excited about it. And there was only one hitch. One of my friends is a little weird, and he's severely ADHD, I guess is the way to describe it. And you just never know what he's going to do or say next. And so I kept coaching him as we were getting ready to start the service. Say, here's what you do. Don't do this. Don't do this. And he said, Mark, I wish you quit telling me what to do. And I said, I wish you would act normal. And we went round and round. And his feelings actually got hurt about it. And I said, I don't want you to embarrass me in front of the church. And then I realized, you know what? I either love him or I don't love him. I care for him or I don't care for him. And I had to change my attitude and approach. And I decided, you know what? If he's going to be weird, then I'm just going to be weird with him. All right? And that's what we've done from then on. And he's one of my closest friends to this day. So love your family. Care for them. Love your friends and care for them. And that is one way to live a life of faithfulness to the very end. Secondly, work diligently. Work diligently. It can be very tempting to coast through life, whether you're in the middle years and you're kind of right on path with your career, whether you're at the end of your career and you're enjoying retirement, whether you're just starting off. It can be easy to coast at any stage. And it can be easy to start to enjoy the extras of life and the luxuries of life. And I think there needs to be something to be said. I think it's important to take vacations with your family. I think that is so important. I think it's important to get away and to know how to relax. I think it's important to how to delegate responsibility. But there's a danger that if we do too much of those things, that we might become lazy, that we might become unmotivated, that we might become so content with where we are that we're not pushing forward to excel in life. And so we need to be people who are working diligently in life. God isn't done with you when you hit a certain level of success or stability. Joseph continued to reach and stretch and grow when he became the second most powerful man in Egypt. Now he's a prime candidate for burnout because here's why. When he got to second in command, he could never be Pharaoh. He could never be number one because he was an Egyptian by birth. And so there's no way he is going to be Pharaoh. Yet, he didn't coast. He didn't take it easy. He worked diligently. He built the barns, and he took in the storehouse, and he distributed the food as the famine hit the land. He took care of the needs in front of him. He worked hard. And I think there needs to be something said for how he distributed the food. We talked about the 7 years of famine. The world was going through a severe time, and people came to Egypt because Egypt was the only land that was prepared for it. And so eventually they ran out of money, which is given. You're buying food. You're not getting an income from your crops because they're not growing. And so they give them all their money, and they come back and say, we need to buy more food, but we have no money. And so Joseph says, well, sell us your livestock. Now they have excess grain. They can afford to use the grain to feed the cattle and to raise livestock. So they brought their livestock in, and they bought their food. Well, then they came back in, and they said, we got nothing left but our lives and our land. Joseph said, sell us your land, and we'll sell you food. And so that's what happened. And this sounds kind of harsh. You're like, man, they're taking advantage of the people in a tough time. No, I think there's some principles at play here that we need to take hold of. When you give people something for nothing, you run the risk of hurting their dignity. Because there is dignity in working and earning something. And you also run the risk of making them lazy, where they start to expect something for nothing all the time. And so Joseph is very cautious about how he handles the people and handles their situation. And he makes sure that they have dignity. I gave something for this food. And he also makes sure that they don't become lazy. Because once the famine begins to end and the fields are ready to produce again, Joseph gives them all seed. He gives them grain to plant. He doesn't give them free-grown crops or anything. He says, no, you're going to get to work. And he says, here's what you're going to do. 20% of everything you grow, you give to Pharaoh. Everything else you keep for yourself. And in a sense, what Joseph created was a buyback program. If you work hard, your fields produce well, then you take your excess, you sell it, and you buy back your land. And history tells us that Egypt became the most powerful nation in the world during this era. Joseph's program for dealing with the needy far surpasses anything our country or any other country in the world has ever done. The people worked hard. They weren't lazy. They weren't given something for nothing. And as a result, they maintained a positive attitude and became a powerful country. In the Christian life, it is so easy to start off excited but to fizzle out. The Bible says we need to have zeal for the Lord. That's the word it likes to use. It was popular in the 1800s. It was almost never used in the 1900s. And today it is even less used than that. And it's a real shame because Google defines zeal as great energy and enthusiasm. The Blue Letter Bible says it's so powerful, the word describes jealousy and envy. A life dedicated to God is what a zeal is. Zeal means God first, period. And let me give you 4 brief examples on how the Bible uses the word. David says, zeal for your house consumes me. Solomon says, always be zealous for fear of the Lord. Isaiah says, the Lord accomplished our salvation by his own zeal. And Paul says he was zealous to honor God in everything he did. We need zealous people for God in the world today. We need people out there who are working diligently. And there's 2 reasons why, and it leads us into our third point. The 2 reasons are, 1, it helps us avoid the pitfalls of our world, because there's a lot of pitfalls. And secondly, it allows us to be a light into the world when we're excited for God and sharing what he's done. Now, the third thing that we need to learn about living a faithful life is maintain your faith in tough waters. And so this really ties into being zealous for God. Joseph was a model of faith in a pagan culture. Now, we live in a pagan culture today. There's no doubt about that. The question is, how do we live in such a way that makes a difference? And I came across an article this week that says what today's Christians can learn from the Christians of the 1st and 2nd centuries. When the Christians first started, there were literally a few dozen of them. By the end of the 1st century, there was a few thousand of them. And by the going into the 2nd and 3rd century, there was 3.5 million Christians. How did it explode in such a paganistic culture as Rome and the other empires at that time? Well, let me read this article by Greg Scanlon. Take me 1.5 minutes. What does this mean for the Christian today? Christians must get used to being a minority in a pagan world. We have to drop the nostalgia for the 1950s and 60s, which were an anomaly for church attendance. For most of our country's history, fewer than 50% of the population attended church. Many attended church in the post-World War II era for social or business reasons, without any real understanding of the faith. Because of this, the church did indeed include many Christians who were bigoted and mean-spirited, and this alienated substantial numbers of people who were looking for the truth. In today's climate, Christians have to restore Christ's message of love and joy, not just talking about it, but living it out every day. That does not mean accommodating ourselves to the pagan world, but witnessing for Jesus within that world. We don't win over pagans by diluting our faith, but by living it out. To do that, we have to identify our world for what it is, pagan. Today's pagans have their own gods, just as the Romans and Babylonians did. The gods of today include sex, political power, celebrity, and they're every bit as futile as the Roman and Babylonian gods were. Last 2 sentences. They fail to bring meaning or contentment to the devotees. Instead, they bring emptiness and dissatisfaction. Worshipping such gods is sad and pathetic, and we should feel compassion for those lost in paganism, welcoming them when they arrive at our door, looking for meaning. We live in a world that ultimately is not going to get better. It is going to get worse, and it's going to continue to honor and love things that we don't. We just keep living out lives of love and joy as Jesus did, and we shine out as a light into our culture. We maintain our faith in tough waters. The majority of Joseph's life was lived in a paganistic environment, and that was not easy. People in that culture worshipped idols. They had temples to goddesses of sex. They worshipped things that were just horrible by any standard. Yet he was able to maintain his faithfulness to God in tough waters. You would think he would have become indulgent after becoming second in command of all of Egypt. You would think that would be the point where Joseph just said, that's it, I'm cutting loose. Solomon did. He was the wisest man to ever live, and he became the biggest fool after he achieved so much wealth and fame, and he didn't know what else to do. And so he took in the excesses of life. Genesis 50:15 says this. But now that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers became fearful. Now Joseph will show his anger and pay us back for all the wrong we did to him, they said. Now we have a transition. Instead of worrying about the paganistic culture, we also have the struggles of family. Now, we already talked about caring for our family. But the brothers are concerned because their crime against Joseph was severe. They sold him as a slave. Now, I know you don't get along with your siblings sometimes, but really, sell them as a slave and to assume that they're dead, that's harsh. That's mean. And now that sibling you sold is in charge of you. And Dad has died. What do we do now? This is a scary time for the brothers. They don't know what's going to happen. They're worried Joseph is going to be looking to get even. It's like the old lady who was bit by a rabid dog, And she went to the doctor, and the doctor said, I'm sorry, you have rabies, you don't have that long to live. And she instantly grabbed a sheet of paper and pen and started writing. The doctor said, oh, you're writing out your will? She said, no, I'm writing out a list of people I'm going to bite. You know, sometimes we hang on to bitterness a little bit longer than we need to. We get tied down in things that happen to us. And the brothers are real concerned that Joseph is hanging on to bitterness too. So here's what we read in Genesis 50. They made up this message. It says, the brothers sent this message to Joseph. Before your father died, he instructed us to say to you, that's a lie, please forgive your brothers for the great wrong they did to you, for the sin in treating you so cruelly. So we, the servants of the God of your father, beg you to forgive our sin. When Joseph received the message, he broke down and wept. Then his brothers came and threw themselves down before Joseph. Look, we are your slaves, they said. But Joseph replied, don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I can punish you? You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. No, don't be afraid. I will continue to take care of you and your children. So he reassured them by speaking kindly to them. The brothers knew their crime was serious, but what they didn't know was Joseph's heart. The heart of the Christian is what makes them truly unique. Max Lucado wrote it this way: God is either the God of perfect grace or he's not God. Grace forgets, period. He who is perfect love cannot hold grudges. And I believe in God's loving forgetfulness. I believe he has a graciously terrible memory. God chooses to forget, to remove all of our sins from us. And Joseph sets the example that even in a difficult water of a family member who won't let something go, you be forgiving and you be forgetful. Joseph moved on, and when his brothers didn't, it says he wept. He was that upset. And that's evidence of Joseph's faithfulness to God and realizing just how good God was to him. Last thing I want you to know today is this: look beyond today. Look beyond today. We're finishing the series today. And we want to look at one more incident in the life of Joseph that shows just how faithful he was until death. Joseph's 110 years old. He calls his brothers in and says, I'm about to die. Now, that's the only time he ever says it. He actually means it, unlike his dad. So, here we go in Genesis chapter 50. Soon I will die, Joseph told his brothers, but God will surely come to you and lead you out of this land of Egypt. He will bring you back to the land he solemnly promised to give Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear on an oath, and he said, when God comes to help you and lead you back, you must take my bones with you. Now, it's my understanding, just the way people operate, if you live in one place for a long period of time, typically, then when it comes time for your burial, that's the place you want to be buried. Makes good sense. You lived there a long time. Joseph has lived in Egypt for 93 years. That's a pretty long time to live in one place. And so for 93 years he's lived there. He said, but when I die, don't bury me completely. No, take my bones with me when you go back home. Joseph was looking beyond today. He was looking to the promises of God, and he believed God would be with the people of Israel for many centuries to come. He remembered God's promise that there was a promised land for these people, and they would be led out. Joseph believed God. Joseph had faith in Potiphar's house. He had it in prison, and he had it in royalty. And God saw him safely through all of this. Joseph never got so rich or so important that he relied on himself and forgot God. Genesis 50:26 says, so Joseph died at the age of 110. The Egyptians embalmed him, and his body was placed in a coffin in Egypt. 400 years later, in Exodus chapter 13, Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt, and they brought the bones of Joseph. Now, Joseph is mentioned only one time in the New Testament. Out of all the wonderful things he did, he's only mentioned one time, and it's in Hebrews chapter 11, God's Hall of Faith, when you see all the acts of faith by the patriarchs like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And here's what it says. It was by faith that Joseph, when he was about to die, said confidently that the people of Israel would leave Egypt. He even commanded them to take his bones with them when they left. The greatest demonstration of Joseph's faith was at the end of his life when he said, it's not what God's just done in my life, it's what God is going to do. When we live our life in light of what God is going to do, give us an eternal heavenly home, it makes all the difference for how we live our life today. If you want to live a life of faith, then you have to look beyond today. Well, as the worship team joins me on the stage, I'd like to read a poem for you written by Richard Baxter. It's a simple 4-line poem about heaven, and it says this. My knowledge of that life is small. The eye of faith is dim. But it's enough that Christ knows all, and I shall be with him. Every day we need to pray that God would use me to be a light and to be love in a pagan world. And that's how we're going to live a life of faithfulness. Paul said we don't lose heart, even though we're wasting away, because we're being renewed day by day. Paul says life and troubles are momentary, and it's achieving for us an eternal glory. He says what is seen is temporary, what is unseen is eternal. Joseph was faithful in every step of his life. When he was abused, he did not retaliate. When he was tempted, he did not yield. When he was forgotten, he was not discouraged. When he was prosperous, he didn't strut. And when he was old, he did not lose heart. Joseph was faithful. May we be the same. But you know, Joseph isn't the only one that's faithful. Jesus was too. He came to a country that was not his own. He was abused and mistreated by his people. He had a coat ripped off of him. He was thrown on the ground and nailed to a cross. And God used what man intended for evil to be good. God used that cross to forgive our sins. This morning, if you need to experience the faithfulness of God through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, I want you to meet me down front as we stand.